Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. The fog had rolled over London like a living veil, thick and pale as muslin dipped in milk. It softened the gas lamps along Baker Street, blurring their amber halos until they seemed like floating stars cast adrift. Midnight approached, but the city's heart still beat. Cabs rattled distantly, boots splashed through puddles, and somewhere a clock chimed 12 slow, mournful notes. Inside 221B, however, time seemed held in suspension. A single candle burned low on the table beside Sherlock Holmes's violin, its glassy flame bowing faintly whenever the wind pressed against the window panes. The room smelled faintly of tobacco, varnished wood, and ink scents familiar enough to any who had crossed its threshold. But tonight there was an unfamiliar presence in the air, something taut, something wrong. Dr. John Watson felt it in the way Holmes stood by the fire, motionless as a carving of himself. His sharp profile was caught in silhouette, the hawk-like nose, the strong chin, the steepled fingers. His gaze, though fixed upon the flames, was turned inward, far inward, as though he stared upon some dark corridor of the mind. Watson cleared his throat. "Holmes, you've scarcely moved in an hour. Is it the case from Scotland Yard?" Lestrade said. The circumstances were most extraordinary. Holmes spoke at last, his voice low and strangely subdued. "No, Watson, not extraordinary, disturbing." Watson blinked. Sherlock Holmes rarely admitted disturbance. Holmes turned then, his eyes glinting with a rare weight, not excitement, not intellectual hunger, but something that reminded Watson of a storm gathering behind glass. "You know, of course," Holmes began, "that there is no puzzle I relish more than that which defies expectation. Yet tonight I have received a message that carries neither challenge nor bravado, but fear, deep fear." Watson stepped closer. "A message?" Holmes lifted a delicate envelope from the mantel. The paper shook faintly as he held it, the slightest tremor, quickly restrained. Wax still clung to the edges of the broken seal. "It arrived by express," Holmes continued, "addressed to me in a hand both hurried and trembling, and inside." He drew out a single card, ivory-colored and smelling of lavender and old wood. Watson frowned. "A calling card?" Holmes nodded. "From Street Mary Mead." Watson's eyebrows rose. "That quiet little village. But who in Street Mary Mead would seek your aid?" Holmes's lips curved faintly, not in a smile, but in recognition of some unseen gravity. "Not who, whom?" He turned the card so the name faced Watson. "Miss Jane Marple." Watson exhaled. "The gentle spinster? The one reputed to solve village crimes with knitting needles in hand?" "Do not underestimate her, Watson," Holmes murmured. "She possesses an acuity masked behind the most unassuming countenance. A remarkable woman, one I have long suspected might equal any detective in England, were she ever coaxed from her village boundaries." Watson read the inked message below her name, small, neat, but shaking ever so slightly. "Mr. Holmes, I fear something dreadful has taken root in our quiet parish. I beg come at once. A life may depend on it. J. Marple." As Watson lifted his eyes, Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "You mean to go at once?" Watson asked. Holmes hesitated, and that, more than anything, unsettled Watson. "Yes," Holmes said at last. "But Watson, there is more." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small silver locket one Watson had never seen before. It bore a delicate crest, the filigree too fine for London craftsmanship. When Holmes clicked it open, the candlelight caught the miniature portrait inside, a young woman with wistful eyes and a melancholic smile. Watson looked sharply at Holmes. "Who is she?" Holmes closed the locket slowly, the metal clicking shut like a whispered secret. "A woman who should not be connected to this matter," he said. and yet she is. Before Watson could speak, Holmes crossed the room in 2 swift strides and extinguished the candle with a pinch of his fingers. Darkness swallowed the room, except for the fire's muted glow. "Watson," Holmes said softly, "something is amiss in Street Mary Mead, something that even I cannot yet see, but Miss Marple can. And if she has called upon me, then I fear the danger is more cunning than any village whisper." The fog outside thickened until it pressed against the windows like pale, unseen hands. Watson felt a shiver. "Then we leave at dawn?" Holmes paused at the doorway, his figure a shadow framed by the corridor's dim light. "No," he whispered, "we leave now. Miss Marple would not have written unless the situation were dire." As they stepped out into the suffocating fog, the last wisp of candle smoke curled upward in the abandoned room, twisting like a question mark in the dark. Somewhere in the distant parish of Street Mary Mead, a secret had already begun to stir. And tonight, it would find its hunters. The clock in Baker Street struck 12:30, a hollow, echoing stroke as the door shut behind them. The mystery had begun. Chapter I, The Discovery. The train hissed like an irritated serpent as it slowed into Much Benham Junction, a modest platform where lanterns flickered against the pre-dawn fog. The countryside beyond was all muted silhouettes, hedgerows drowned in grey, distant barns like crouching beasts, and fields spread out in a hush that felt older than memory itself. Sherlock Holmes stepped onto the cold platform with the same precision and poise with which he approached a crime scene. His coat fluttered briefly in the chilly breeze, while Dr. Watson followed, pulling his collar tight. A single figure waited beneath the iron canopy, small, still, wrapped in a pale grey shawl. "Miss Jane Marple." Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Marple." She offered a warm, gentle smile, the kind one might expect from a dear aunt, not from a woman whose intuition could unpick human nature with surgical accuracy. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming with such haste." Holmes's sharp gaze swept over her face, reading the faint tension in her eyes. "Your letter suggested urgency, madam." "Yes," she said softly, clasping her gloves. "I fear urgency is precisely what we have." Watson leaned in. "Is someone harmed?" Miss Marple lowered her voice, her breath trembling in the cold. "I believe someone is about to be, or perhaps already has been, though no one in the village yet realizes it." Holmes exchanged a look with Watson for Jane Marple, a woman who noticed danger long before it ripened. Such words carried gravity. "Come," she said. "My cottage is but a short walk, and there is much I must show you before others awaken." Street Mary Mead at dawn was a portrait of tranquility. Chimneys released soft plumes of blue smoke, roosters crowed in distant gardens, dew clung to rose petals in neat front lawns. But beneath this postcard-perfect stillness, Holmes sensed a faint discord, as though the village itself held its breath. Miss Marple's cottage stood modest and ivy-clad. Warm light glowed in the parlour window. Inside, the smell of lavender sachets mingled with the faint aroma of tea left warming on the stove. She led them into the sitting-room. Holmes immediately surveyed the surroundings. Doilies perfectly arranged, a mantel clock ticking reliably, lace curtains trimmed with careful hands, and yet, on the small writing desk by the window, there lay an object entirely out of place. A blood-stained handkerchief. Watson stiffened. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple spoke quietly, almost apologetically. "I found it yesterday morning in my back garden. At first I thought some poor creature had injured itself. But, Mr. Holmes, this is human blood." Holmes stepped forward, bending to examine the cloth with delicate precision. "Feminine linen, embroidered initials, E.H. And the stain is fresh hours old when you found it, no more." He inhaled slowly. "No sign of forced entry into your garden, I presume?" "None," Miss Marple replied, "but one does not need to climb fences if one is already inside the village." Holmes straightened. "And whom do these initials belong to?" Miss Marple hesitated, unusual for her. The lace of her handkerchief trembled in her fingers. "Miss Emily Harper," she said at last. "A young schoolteacher. Kind-hearted, shy, recently arrived from Devon. She boarded with Mrs. Weatherby in the High Street." Watson frowned. "Recently arrived, you say? How recently?" "3 months," Miss Marple answered. "And, if I may say so, she has been troubled of late. Quite troubled." Holmes turned sharply. "In what manner?" Miss Marple looked toward the window, as though speaking to the garden itself. She often seemed frightened, jumping at shadows, glancing down lanes as though she feared being followed. And twice she came to see me. Watson's eyes widened. "To confide something?" Miss Marple nodded, though she spoke in half whispers. "Poor girl. She said someone from her past had found her. Someone dangerous." Holmes's pupils narrowed with keen interest. "And where is Miss Harper now?" Miss Marple exhaled. "That, Mr. Holmes, is the problem. She has not been seen since yesterday afternoon." A silence fell thick, heavy, and grave. Holmes moved to the window, examining the view of Miss Marple's garden, his gaze tracing invisible paths. "Tell me everything," he murmured. Miss Marple folded her hands. Emily Harper had been walking home from the schoolhouse. She never arrived. When Mrs. Weatherby went to look for her, Emily's satchel was found in a ditch by the old footpath. But no one thought much of it. Villagers assume misplacement before mischief. Only I felt certain something was amiss. Holmes turned swiftly. "A satchel in a ditch is never trivial. What of the constabulary?" "Oh, Inspector Crail believes she simply visited friends in the next village and will reappear this morning." Holmes gave a short, humorless exhale. "Inspector Crail is an optimist." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A generous way of putting it." Watson tapped the handkerchief. "You found this in your own garden. Why would it be there?" "That is what troubles me," Miss Marple whispered. "Emily came to me twice before. Perhaps she tried to come again. Perhaps she was hurt before she reached my door." Holmes turned the handkerchief delicately in his fingertips. "Or," he said slowly, "someone wished you to find it." A chill crept across Watson's spine. What would that imply? Miss Marple's voice lowered. "That someone in this village, someone familiar with our habits, our cottages, our movements, wants Mr. Holmes here." Holmes stilled. "You believe I was summoned?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "because Emily would not embroider her own initials so boldly. This handkerchief was a gift from Mrs. Weatherby. She told me so last week. Which means whoever used it to staunch a wound either took it from Emily or took it from her room." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Forced disappearance, intimate knowledge of her belongings, staging a message at your home. This is no crime of passion. This bears deliberation." Watson asked gently, "Miss Marple, was Emily ever involved in anything dangerous before she came here?" Miss Marple hesitated again. "She mentioned," she said carefully, "an involvement with a gentleman in Devon, a man who grew obsessive." She glanced up. She did not give a name, but she said something that has weighed upon my mind. "He will never let me go, Miss Marple, never." Holmes exchanged a dark look with Watson. Obsession is fertile ground for violence. He paced the room slowly, fingertips tapping against his palm. "There is another question," he said. "Why ask for my help? If Emily sought your guidance, why involve a detective she had surely never met?" Miss Marple walked to a small wooden drawer and retrieved a second item, a neatly folded letter. "Because of this," she said, offering it to Holmes. "I received it 3 days ago, before her disappearance, before the handkerchief." Holmes unfolded it. Watson leaned over his shoulder. "Miss Marple, if ever you feel uncertain, or if I should vanish as I fear I may, please seek the assistance of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He must know the truth, for I cannot speak it aloud. I am watched. Emily H." Watson whispered. "She knew something dreadful was coming, and she feared speaking it," Miss Marple said, "which makes me think the danger was already here." Holmes snapped the letter shut. Then we must investigate immediately. He turned toward the door, but Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "There is more, Mr. Holmes." Holmes paused. Miss Marple pointed to a small side table. Upon it lay a folded shawl, pale blue, with delicate stitching. Emily Harper's shawl. Watson frowned. "Where was that found?" Miss Marple sighed. "In my sitting room." Holmes sharply turned. "Impossible. It was not here when we entered." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "It was not here last night either." Holmes approached the shawl. It was still faintly damp from the morning fog. "Someone entered your home to place this." Watson swallowed hard. "But why risk such intrusion?" Holmes's eyes darkened, the fire of deduction igniting. "To send a message," he said, "to show us what they can do, and to tell us—" He lifted the shawl, revealing beneath it a single object that had been tucked carefully out of sight. A silver locket. The same locket Holmes had shown Watson in Baker Street. His breath caught. Watson whispered, "Holmes, how did it get here?" Holmes stared at it, unblinking. He spoke very quietly. "This locket belonged to a woman I once knew, a woman who died years ago under circumstances I never fully understood." Miss Marple stepped closer, her calm eyes steady. "Mr. Holmes, I believe whoever took Emily Harper is not merely dangerous." She paused. "They are connected to you." The room chilled. Holmes's jaw tightened, not with fear, but with the rare sting of personal entanglement. Watson murmured, "This is no ordinary case." Holmes lifted the locket in his gloved hand, and the candlelight caught its trembling silver face. "No," Holmes said, "this is something far darker." Miss Marple folded her hands over her shawl. "Welcome to Street Mary Mead, Mr. Holmes." The clock on her mantel chimed softly, a deceptively gentle note marking the beginning of a storm. Chapter 2. The morning mist had begun to lift from Street Mary Mead, peeling away from the rooftops and orchards with a reluctant grace. The village revealed itself slowly: red-tiled chimneys, whitewashed walls, crooked signboards, and the glint of dew on paling fences. Somewhere nearby, a cockerel crowed again, as if to insist that this was an ordinary English morning, and not the beginning of a shadowed inquiry. Miss Marple fetched her hat and gardening jacket, fastening the buttons with careful fingers. "If you don't mind, Mr. Holmes," she said, "I should like to take you first to the path where Emily's satchel was discovered. One ought always to begin with where a person was last known to be. People do not simply evaporate even when others behave as though they do." Holmes nodded. "Agreed, Miss Marple. The scene of vanishing is the scene of greatest deceit." Watson took up his walking stick. "And Inspector Crail?" "He will no doubt appear when he believes it theatrically appropriate," Miss Marple said mildly. "He is very fond of entrances." They stepped out into the village lane. A milk cart rattled past, the driver tipping his cap. Two women standing at a gate lowered their voices as the trio passed, eyes bright with curiosity. News travelled quickly in villages. Suspicion travelled faster. Holmes strode with his usual briskness, but his gaze missed nothing: the narrowness of the lanes, the vantage points from windows, the places where hedges grew thick enough for a person to linger unseen. "An excellent stage for observation," he murmured. Miss Marple smiled. "And for mischief. Human nature doesn't lessen as the houses get smaller, Mr. Holmes. It only becomes more visible." They reached the old footpath that wound from the schoolhouse towards the high street, crossing a small stream and skirting the rear of several gardens, including Miss Marple's own. The path was of packed earth, bordered by hedgerow and bramble dotted with the first primroses. "There," Miss Marple said, pointing to a shallow ditch beside the path. "Emily's satchel was found just there, yesterday afternoon, by young Tommy Briggs on his way home." Holmes knelt by the ditch, his long fingers hovering over the damp earth. He studied the faint disturbances in the soil, as a priest might study a sacred text. "Watson," he said, "observe the trampling here. Multiple sets of prints, though the rain and passage of villagers have obscured much. Yet here, he indicated a deeper print, the outline barely discernible. A man's shoe, he said, narrow with a distinctive heel, not local manufacture, London perhaps. Watson frowned. You can tell that from so little? Holmes gave him a sidelong look. You have been my chronicler for how many years, and still you ask? Miss Marple bent slightly, peering over his shoulder. Not one of the villagers, then, she said thoughtfully. Most of our men wear stout country boots. I suppose that is something. Something indeed, Holmes replied, but more interesting is this. He moved a few inches along the ditch and gently parted a tuft of grass. Beneath it, almost invisible, lay the faint imprint of a small heel. A woman's shoe, he said, size modest, the pressure light. She stumbled here, see how the earth scuffed, and then nothing. He straightened, his gaze drifting along the path towards Miss Marple's back garden wall. Could she have been taken from here? Watson asked quietly. Forced from the path into the hedge? Holmes shook his head. No significant drag marks. If she left the path unwillingly, her assailant was either remarkably cautious or she went willingly, Miss Marple finished softly. Holmes looked at her with a flicker of approval. Quite so. Perhaps she met someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to walk aside with, or someone she feared so much that she dared not refuse. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. Fear can look very much like acquiescence. They followed the path towards her garden, passing the low flagstone where Tommy Briggs had reported seeing the satchel. Holmes paused, scanning the hedge. "Where is the satchel now?" he asked. "With Inspector Crail," Miss Marple replied. "He took charge of it yesterday, after remarking that children ought not to play at being detectives." Holmes's mouth twitched faintly. "I shall look forward to conversing with him." They emerged near the back of Miss Marple's cottage, where the garden fanned out in neat borders and vegetable beds. A small gate opened onto the lane. Miss Marple paused beside it, her gloved hand resting on the latch. "I often stand here in the evenings," she said quietly, watching the sunset over the fields. "If Emily had come this way to seek my help, she might have called my name from this very spot." Holmes regarded the gate, his face unreadable. He ran his fingertip along the latch, then the upper bar of the gate. Watson saw his eyes sharpen. "What is it, Holmes?" Watson asked. Holmes held up his gloved finger. A faint smear of dark residue clung to it. "Dried blood," he said, "not much a trace. Whoever bled into that handkerchief left at least a few drops here." He glanced up. "Miss Marple, was there any blood visible when you found the handkerchief?" "No," she said slowly. "Only on the cloth itself. I saw no stains here." "Then someone has since wiped them away," Holmes murmured. "Not thoroughly, but enough to fool any casual eye." Miss Marple's lips tightened. "Someone meticulous, then?" "Meticulous," Holmes agreed, "and brave enough to return to the scene. We are dealing with an individual who wishes to direct what we see and perhaps what we do not see." A crow cawed from a distant tree. The sound felt like an ill omen. Mrs. Weatherby's lodging-house stood on the high street, its front door shining with freshly applied polish, brass knocker gleaming. A small sign read, "Respectable rooms, ladies preferred." Mrs. Weatherby herself opened the door before Miss Marple could knock, having evidently been watching from behind the lace curtains. She was a stout woman with anxious eyes and an apron that spoke of perpetual kitchen warfare. "Miss Marple? Oh, and gentlemen," she added, eyeing Holmes and Watson with curiosity. "Come in, do come in. I suppose it's about poor Miss Harper, though I dare say she's only stayed the night with her cousin in East Charis. Young ladies are thoughtless, you know." Miss Marple's tone was soothing. "We are simply trying to understand Emily's movements yesterday, Mrs. Weatherby. This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, from London." Mrs. Weatherby blinked. "From London? Goodness me, I hope it isn't anything serious." Holmes gave a courteous incline of the head. "We hope so too, madam. May we see Miss Harper's room?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated, fingers twisting her apron tie. "Well, yes, I suppose. But I've not touched a thing, save to pull the curtains back. Couldn't sleep a wink, thinking of her poor bed lying empty. This way, if you please." She led them up a narrow flight of stairs that creaked in protest at each step. Emily Harper's room was small but bright, a single bed, a washstand, a modest wardrobe, and a desk beneath the window. The air held a faint trace of violet scent. Watson felt an odd pang. A vanished young woman always left a peculiar silence behind her, louder than any noise. Holmes moved immediately to the desk, his eyes scanning the surface. A few exercise books, a well-used fountain pen, a slim volume of poetry, no letter paper, no envelopes. "How long has Miss Harper been absent?" Holmes asked without turning. "Since yesterday afternoon," Mrs. Weatherby replied. "She left the school at the usual time. Miss Finch from the post office saw her passing, but she never came home." "Did she seem troubled? Preoccupied?" Holmes's tone was light, conversational. Mrs. Weatherby sniffed. "She's been out of sorts for a fortnight. Jumpy, always glancing over her shoulder. Sometimes she'd start awake at night, I could hear her. But if I asked, she'd smile and say she was simply tired. Young ladies, Mr. Holmes, have a way of keeping their own counsel." Holmes opened the top drawer of the desk, empty. "The drawer?" he asked. Mrs. Weatherby flushed faintly. "Well, I did look in there. I thought perhaps there might be an address for her cousin, but it was already empty. She kept some letters in her suitcase instead." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Letters? From whom?" Mrs. Weatherby shifted uncomfortably. I couldn't say exactly. I only saw the initial. M. Quite a few of them, all tied up with a ribbon. She kept them at the bottom of her case." Holmes closed the drawer gently. "And where is the suitcase now?" "In the wardrobe," Mrs. Weatherby said. "Packed, more or less. She always said she liked things ready to hand." Holmes opened the wardrobe. A neat row of dresses, a coat, shoes, and at the bottom, a medium-sized leather case. He lifted it onto the bed and flicked open the catches. The interior was tidy. A folded blouse, spare stockings, a small box of hairpins, but no letters, no ribbon. "Mrs. Weatherby," Holmes said quietly, "are you certain you saw letters here before?" "Positive," she replied, her cheeks reddening. "I shouldn't have peeked, I know, but they were plainly there, thicker than the usual. I remember thinking how romantic it all seemed, a secret correspondence." Holmes exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "Someone has removed them," he said. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, and not Emily, I think. If she had intended to run away, she would hardly leave her favorite dress hanging in the wardrobe." Holmes's eyes drifted to the bedside table, where a single framed photograph stood. He picked it up with careful fingers. A studio portrait showed Emily Harper in a simple dress, her expression gentle, her eyes slightly wary even in repose. Beside her stood an older woman with kind features, perhaps a mother, and on the back was written in neat ink, "To my dearest Emily, wherever you go, my heart goes with you, Mother." Holmes studied Emily's face. There was something fragile there, and something stubborn too. "She feared someone," he said softly, "yet she also hoped to outpace them." Watson moved to the window, looking down onto the high street. "Holmes, the schoolhouse is visible from here." Holmes joined him. Across the rooftops, the small building stood at the end of the lane, playground empty, windows dark. "How many saw her leave yesterday?" Holmes asked. Miss Marple answered, "The children, certainly. Miss Finch from the post office saw her walking up High Street. Mr. Pierce, the village doctor, believes he glimpsed her by the green. Beyond that, it becomes vague." Watson turned back to Mrs. Weatherby. "Did anyone call upon Miss Harper recently? Any strangers?" Mrs. Weatherby bit her lip. "There was one gentleman, tall, fair, well-dressed, came asking after her a week ago, said he was an old family friend. I thought he looked rather sly. Emily refused to see him. I heard her whispering at the door to her room. Tell him I'm not here, please." Holmes's voice cooled. "Did he give a name?" "He wrote it in the visitor's book," Mrs. Weatherby said, flustered. "I always require it. I'll fetch it." When she had gone, Holmes turned swiftly to Miss Marple. "An M in the letters," he said. "A mysterious gentleman visitor. A history in Devon with an obsessive suitor. I begin to see the outline of a shape." "A dangerous one?" Miss Marple asked. Holmes's eyes hardened. "Very." Mrs. Weatherby returned with a small ledger. Holmes opened it, flipping through until he found the most recent entries. There it was, written in a bold, confident hand. "Mr. Marcus Llewellyn." Holmes stared at the name with an intensity that made Watson uneasy. "Holmes?" Watson ventured. Holmes closed the ledger abruptly. "Thank you, Mrs. Weatherby. You have been most helpful." Mrs. Weatherby wrung her hands. "You don't truly think that Emily's been harmed, do you?" Holmes did not answer. It was Miss Marple who spoke, her voice gentle. "I think, dear, that Emily was in some sort of trouble, and we must take such troubles seriously, mustn't we?" Mrs. Weatherby's eyes filled. "Oh, poor girl. I should have insisted she tell me more." "Guilt is the most inventive of tortures," Miss Marple said kindly. "Do not fashion a whip for yourself just yet." The schoolhouse at Street Mary Mead smelt faintly of chalk, ink, and polished wood. Rows of small desks stood ready for the day's lessons, though the clock above the blackboard ticked to a room empty of children. A young woman in a brown cardigan and horn-rimmed spectacles stood by the teacher's desk, stacking exercise books. She looked up as they entered, a crease of worry instantly appearing between her brows. "Oh, Miss Marple, and gentlemen." "This is Miss Ivy Finch," Miss Marple said. "She assists at the post office and occasionally at the school." Holmes inclined his head. "Miss Finch, I understand you were among the last to see Miss Harper yesterday." "Yes," Ivy said nervously. "She passed the post office at about 4:30. I was just closing the shutters. She looked tired, but she smiled. She always smiled, even when she seemed frightened." Holmes approached, his voice softened. "Frightened how, Miss Finch?" Ivy hesitated, glancing reflexively at Miss Marple, who gave her an encouraging nod. "She jumped at loud noises," Ivy said. "And once, when a stranger came into the shop and stood too close behind her, she went quite pale and dropped her letters. After he left, she told me she felt as though someone were walking over her grave." "Did you know the stranger?" Holmes asked. "No, he didn't give his name, but he posted a letter to London, I think. The envelope had a city address." She frowned. "Tall, fair, well-dressed, like the gentleman who called at Mrs. Weatherby's. I wondered if it was the same man." Holmes's eyes flicked briefly to Miss Marple. "And did Emily receive many letters herself?" "A few," Ivy replied. "Mostly from her mother. But there was one that upset her dreadfully. She came to collect it last week, postmarked from Devon, and when she saw the handwriting, she trembled so hard I thought she might faint." Ivy swallowed. She said, "They've found me." Then she tore the envelope into pieces right there at the counter and threw them away. Holmes's voice was quiet. "Did you notice the sender's name?" Ivy shook her head sadly. "No, but I did see the initial on the back of the envelope. Anne M." "Again," Watson murmured. Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her eyes were keen. "In a village," she said, "one hears little fragments, someone's tears in the lane, a remark at the grocer, and one begins to see a pattern long before others do. I fear Emily was doing a very brave and very foolish thing, trying to run away from a person whose temper she had already learned." Holmes stepped toward the blackboard, absently picking up a piece of chalk, then setting it down again. "Miss Finch?" he asked. "Did Miss Harper confide in any gentleman here in the village? A friend, perhaps? Someone she might trust?" Miss Finch coloured faintly. "Well, there is Mr. Peter Langford. He comes from the next village, a writer, he says. Rather handsome. The children adore him. He sometimes read them stories when Miss Harper lost her voice. He and Emily would talk after class." Holmes's tone sharpened imperceptibly. Was their friendship cordial only? Ivy looked uncomfortable. I'm sure it was, but people talk, you know. Mrs. Price at the grocer's, said Emily, ought to be more careful of appearances. Mr. Langford is not married, and some thought she encouraged his visits. Miss Marple sighed softly. Ladies are so often blamed for the attentions they receive. Holmes's gaze drifted around the room once more, then settled briefly on a small dark stain near the doorframe. He bent, examined it. Merely ink, he said. Children's mischief. Watson watched him, knowing that even the most casual glance meant an imprint on that extraordinary mind. Thank you, Miss Finch, Holmes said. You have offered us much to think upon. Ivy bit her lip. You will find her, won't you, Emily? She was so kind. She once walked little Rosie Hughes home in the rain, all the way up the hill, and never complained about her stockings. Holmes paused. I will do everything in my power, he said quietly. That I promise. It was late afternoon when Inspector Crail finally decided to appear. Holmes and Watson had returned to Miss Marple's cottage, where a kettle hummed companionably on the hob and a candle burned on the table despite the lingering daylight. Miss Marple believed candlelight made people more honest about their worries. Watson had long since ceased to argue with such notions. He had seen too much. Holmes stood by the window, the silver locket lying on his open palm. The portrait inside seemed to look back at him accusingly. Lydia, he thought, with a sudden sharp pang, have you risen from the dead to haunt my failures? There had been an inquest, years ago, a river, a rocky bank, a verdict of misadventure. Yet Holmes had never fully believed it. He had been away on a case in Belgium at the time. When he returned, she was gone, and now her locket lay in Miss Marple's parlour like a ghost placed by an unseen hand. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she watched him from her armchair. Guilt, Mr. Holmes, she said gently, is a stubborn thing. It clings, whether or not it is justified. Holmes closed the locket. You read minds as easily as I read footprints, Miss Marple. Oh no, she replied, smiling faintly. Only faces, and hands, and the way people stare at objects they hold. A firm knock sounded at the door. Ah, Miss Marple murmured, that will be Inspector Crail. He stamps rather than knocks authority, you know. Watson opened the door to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit, moustache clipped with military precision. His expression was not hostile, merely indulgent, as one might look upon an over-enthusiastic amateur. Miss Marple, he said briskly, entering without invitation. I hear you've summoned half of London to our sleepy little village. Not half, she said pleasantly. Only one of its more competent residents, Inspector Crail. This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Crail blinked, reassessing. The Sherlock Holmes? Holmes offered a courteous nod. At your service, Inspector. Crail's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, I suppose it can do no harm, though I assure you there is no case here. Miss Harper will no doubt turn up with an explanation and a blush. Young women do. Holmes's voice was cool silk. And the blood-stained handkerchief found in Miss Marple's garden? An accident, Crail said. Nosebleed, cut finger, nothing dramatic. I've sent for a doctor to look at it. Forensics, they call it now. All very modern. And the missing letters removed from Miss Harper's suitcase? Holmes asked. Crail frowned. Mrs. Weatherby tells you too much. If there were letters, and that's an if, they are no concern of the police. Private correspondences seldom are. Holmes's eyes glittered. On the contrary, Inspector, private correspondences are often the seeds of public calamity. Crail bristled, then seemed to remember himself. Look here, Mr. Holmes, he said. I respect your reputation, but this is a small village, not a London alley. We cannot go stirring up panic on the basis of nerves and gossip. Miss Marple's needles paused for the first time. Gossip, she said mildly, is frequently the raw material of truth, Inspector. One must only sift it gently. Crail exhaled through his nose. If Miss Harper does not return by tomorrow, I shall widen the search. Until then, I ask that you do not alarm the villagers with talk of abduction and the like." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, then smiled thinly. "As you wish, Inspector. I shall content myself with observation for now." Crail adjusted his hat. "Good. See that you do." He turned to leave, then paused, eyeing the locket on the table. "Pretty trinket," he remarked. "Yours, Miss Marple?" "An old memory," she said serenely. "They have a way of turning up." He snorted faintly and departed, the door closing behind him with officious finality. Watson let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Stubborn fellow." "Not stupid," Holmes said thoughtfully, merely blinkered. "He does not wish for a crime, therefore he will not see one." Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "The most dangerous crimes are those no one wishes to see." Holmes sank into the chair opposite the candle, the shadows carving sharp lines into his face. The flame flickered in the darkening room, its light reflected in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "someone brought this locket here, someone who knows my past better than I might wish. And my garden," she added, "and Emily's laundry. It is quite an intimate little circle, isn't it?" Holmes tapped the table with one finger, rhythm steady, mind racing. "Marcus Llewellyn," he murmured, "a name I have heard, though not loudly, a solicitor's clerk in Devon some years back, involved peripherally in a case I once declined to take." Lydia knew him faintly. He looked up, meeting Miss Marple's clear gaze. "If he is the man who pursued Emily from Devon," Holmes said, "then this is no coincidence. He has orchestrated something that touches both your quiet village and my own neglected ghosts." The candle flame shivered as a draught crept under the door. Watson rose to close the gap and stopped. "Holmes," he said slowly, "did you leave your pipe on the mantelpiece?" Holmes glanced up sharply. "No, why?" Watson pointed. There, on the mantel above the candle, lay a pipe, not Holmes's, a different shape, a different polish, and beside it, propped against the clock, was a small folded slip of paper. Miss Marple's knitting fell still again. Holmes rose, every sense alert. He crossed the room in 2 strides and took up the note. Unfolded, it contained only 3 words, written in a hand both elegant and unnervingly familiar. "Do you remember?" Holmes's face turned as hard as chiseled stone. Watson swallowed. "What does it mean?" Holmes's eyes did not leave the note. "It means," he said softly, "that our adversary has been in this room, recently, while we were away, and that he knows precisely which wound to touch." Miss Marple leaned forward, the candlelight gilding the fine lines of her face. "And does he have reason?" she asked. "To fear what you might remember, Mr. Holmes." Holmes did not answer. Outside, the last light seeped from the sky, leaving Street Mary Mead in the embrace of gathering night. The candle between them burned a fraction lower, its flame dancing as though in anticipation. Somewhere close, perhaps too close, a man with pale eyes and a patient smile might be watching a cottage window, waiting for the moment when memory and danger would collide. And Emily Harper, whether alive or dead, remained a question hanging over them all. Chapter 3. Evening wrapped itself around Street Mary Mead like a velvety shroud. A solitary lamplighter moved down the lane, his pole-tapping glass as soft amber circles bloomed against the gathering dark. Inside Miss Marple's cottage, the little sitting-room glowed with firelight and a single candle, its flame wavering ever so slightly, as though disturbed by things unseen. Sherlock Holmes sat rigidly at the table, fingers steepled beneath his chin, the anonymous note lying before him like a taunt. "Do you remember?" Dr. Watson observed him anxiously, sensing that the words had struck Holmes deeper than he wished to admit. Miss Marple, from her armchair, watched them both with the serene gravity of a portrait come to life. "Memory," she said quietly, "is a most peculiar servant, Mr. Holmes. It obeys only when it chooses. Sometimes it reveals too much, sometimes far too little." Holmes did not look up. "This is not a trick of sentiment, Miss Marple. The handwriting, the phrasing, this was written by someone who knows me intimately, and who also has access to your past, she added. A past connected to a young woman whose locket now rests upon my table. Holmes's eyes flicked toward the silver locket, its portrait glowing faintly in the candlelight. Watson broke the silence. Holmes, Lydia, you never truly spoke of her. Holmes closed his eyes briefly, not in weakness but in discipline. Several years ago, he began slowly, I was engaged in a case in Devon involving a syndicate of forgers. Their operations extended along the coast, and a young woman, Lydia Fairfax, lived in the village where I lodged during the investigation. Miss Marple nodded gently. Fairfax, a Devon name. I knew a Fairfax once fond of needlework and poetry. Holmes continued. She was intelligent, curious, possessed of a certain quiet courage. She assisted me once or twice, unintentionally, perhaps simply by being observant. When the case concluded, I urged her to leave Devon. There were men, unsavory men, who feared her knowledge. Watson leaned forward. But she didn't leave? Holmes's voice sank. She said she had reasons to stay, family reasons, but a few months later I received news. She had fallen down a rocky embankment into the river, drowned. The verdict was misadventure. Miss Marple's needles did not move. She sat utterly still. And you never believed it, she said softly. Holmes opened his eyes. They were hard, bright, and hollow. No, for the simple reason that 2 days before her death, she sent me a letter. In it she wrote, "If anything happens to me, it will not be by chance." The candle flickered. Watson drew in a sharp breath. "My dear Holmes, why did you never investigate?" "I did," Holmes said calmly. "There was no proof, no motive, and no suspect except a young solicitor's clerk who had admired Lydia from afar, a man named Marcus Llewellyn." Miss Marple inhaled. "Llewellyn? The name written in Mrs. Weatherby's visitor book?" Holmes nodded. "Which means, Miss Marple, that the man who pursued Emily Harper is the same man who once hovered around Lydia Fairfax, and now he claims a place in this village, in your garden, in your parlour." Watson glanced at the door, suddenly conscious of how thin the cottage walls were. "A dangerous man, then?" "No," Holmes corrected softly. "A patient man, the most dangerous kind." Miss Marple rose, moving to the window. She parted the lace curtain slightly, peering out into the darkened lane. "It is late," she murmured, "but one part of the village never sleeps at this hour." Holmes turned. "Which part?" "The green," she replied, "and the path near the vicarage. Some of our younger residents prefer to wander after dusk, courting, quarrelling, whispering secrets they think no one hears." Holmes rose immediately. "Secrets are precisely what we require." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile. "Then we shall go, but quietly, Mr. Holmes. Street Mary Mead has ears everywhere." The village green lay under a pale moon, the grass silvered, the shadows deepening around the edges. A soft breeze stirred the branches of the oak tree at its centre. The three walked without speaking, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Holmes suddenly raised a hand. "Listen." Voices, too, low and earnest, coming from behind the churchyard wall. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Ah, young Mr. Pierce, the doctor's son. And yes, Miss Clara Weatherby, they've been walking together for weeks now, quite sweetly." Holmes moved silently toward the voices, motioning Watson and Miss Marple to remain. He approached the corner of the wall, not close enough to intrude, just enough to hear. Clara's voice trembled. "But Peter, I saw her. I saw Emily, yesterday, near the meadow. She was walking quickly, looking over her shoulder. She had her shawl with her, the blue one. And she said," Clara lowered her voice, "she said someone had written her another letter. She was frightened, Peter." Peter Pierce whispered urgently, "We must tell someone." "I tried to tell Mother, but she said I was being dramatic. Miss Marple believes me, though. She always does." "Emily must have gone somewhere safe," Peter insisted, though his voice wavered. "Perhaps she's with the vicar's sister." No, Clara whispered. She said she might go to Miss Marple's. She said if anything happened before she reached her, we should tell. Holmes stepped around the corner, his voice calm but commanding. Tell whom, Miss Clara? Clara gasped. Peter jumped. Oh, Mr. Holmes, sir, we didn't mean to eavesdrop, I mean— Miss Marple approached softly. You weren't eavesdropping, dear. You were helping. What did Emily ask you to tell? Clara swallowed, gathering courage. That the person who followed her wasn't a stranger. She said she'd seen him before, years ago, in Devon. Holmes's pulse quickened. And she said, Clara continued, that if she disappeared, we should tell you, Miss Marple, that the man's eyes were very pale and that he always carried a silver pipe. Miss Marple and Watson exchanged a look, then both turned toward Holmes. Holmes's face drained of colour. Watson whispered, Holmes? The pipe left on the mantelpiece. Yes, Holmes said quietly. Our adversary announces himself with flourish. Clara shivered. Miss Marple, do you think Emily was taken? Miss Marple rested a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. I think Emily was frightened, dear, and when people are frightened, they sometimes make hasty choices, but you have done the right thing in telling us. Holmes spoke in a low tone. Miss Clara, did Emily say where she had last seen this man? Clara wiped her eyes. Only that he sometimes followed her near the meadow, and once she thought she saw him near your cottage, Miss Marple. Holmes stiffened. Miss Marple patted Clara's arm. Thank you, my dear. You must go home now, both of you. They hurried away. Holmes turned immediately to the others. The meadow, near the footpath behind your garden, that is where Emily last believed she was followed. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Then that is where we must go. The meadow spread behind the village like an open, moonlit sea. Grass rippled in long waves beneath the breeze, and the distant hedgerows cast ink-black shadows. Holmes walked ahead, shoulders taut, gaze fixed on the faintly worn trail leading into the tall grass. There, he said suddenly, pointing. Watson, your lantern. Watson lifted the small lantern Miss Marple had pressed upon him before they left. Its warm circle of light illuminated something half hidden in the grass. A scrap of blue wool. Holmes knelt, lifting it between his fingertips. Fabric torn from Emily's shawl, he murmured. The same fibre, the same pale weave. Miss Marple crouched beside him, her voice soft and steady. She struggled here. Yes, Holmes whispered, and not alone. He moved forward along the flattened line of grass. The marks were subtle. Someone had attempted to conceal their passage, but to Holmes's trained eyes they were vivid. Footprints, he said. 2 sets. One light and hurried Emily's, the other longer, more deliberate, pressed deeper. A man's. He followed the trail until it veered sharply toward a cluster of trees at the edge of the meadow. There, the footprints ended, or rather, blended with the natural indentations of the earth. But not before Holmes found something else. Near the base of an oak lay another handkerchief, white, crisp, embroidered not with initials this time, but with a motif of laurel leaves. Holmes picked it up. Watson frowned. Another handkerchief? No, Holmes said quietly. The same maker, same thread. Whoever used the first handkerchief to staunch a wound used one from a matching set. Miss Marple's eyes widened just slightly, meaning they were carried deliberately. Holmes nodded. Carried because they expected to spill blood? A shiver rippled through the air. Watson looked around nervously. Holmes, where could he have taken her from here? This meadow stretches for miles. Holmes stood still, closing his eyes briefly, seeking a mental map of the area. Miss Marple answered first. There is an old shepherd's hut, she said, quite abandoned, near the far hedgerow. Children dare one another to go inside, very draughty, very private. Holmes opened his eyes. Show us. Miss Marple led the way, her steps brisk despite her age. She knew these grounds intimately. She walked with purpose. The grass thickened, the moon dimmed behind clouds, and the hedgerow rose like a wall of thorns. There, she whispered. A small wooden hut sat half hidden among tangled branches, its door slightly ajar. The lantern in Watson's hand flickered across the weathered boards. Holmes raised a hand. "Stay behind me." He pushed the door slowly. It creaked open. Inside was darkness. Holmes entered first. Watson and Miss Marple followed. The lantern light spilled over floorboards, old crates, a rusted pail. And then, Watson gasped, "There on the floor!" Holmes knelt instantly. A smear of dried blood, not large, but unmistakable. Nearby lay a broken button, feminine, mother of pearl. Miss Marple inhaled sharply. "Emily's." Holmes examined the blood. At least a day old, she was here. Bound, held, perhaps struck. Watson whispered, "But where is she now?" Holmes rose slowly. His face had shifted, no longer only sharp intellect, but something colder, something personal. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "this is no longer a search for a missing woman. This is a hunt." Miss Marple's eyes, though troubled, were steady. "And we have a hunter who believes himself clever." Holmes tapped the broken button in his palm. "He makes mistakes, Miss Marple. Small ones, a thread here, a fibre there. He believes he is writing the script, but even the best playwrights leave clues for the audience." Watson looked between them. "Where do we go now?" Holmes turned toward the door of the hut, listening to the wind, the distant rustle of leaves, the low hoot of an owl. "Now," he said, "we visit Mr. Peter Langford." Miss Marple blinked. "The writer?" "Yes," Holmes said softly. "The admirer, the man who read stories to the children, and the only person Emily spent time with who has not yet been questioned." Miss Marple considered this. "And why him first?" Holmes's voice was low. "Because unlike the others, Mr. Langford lives on the road that leads out of this meadow, and because an obsessive pursuer is dangerous." He held up the broken button. "But so is a jealous admirer." The wind howled suddenly against the hut, rattling the rotted boards. Holmes's eyes flashed in the lantern light. "And tonight, Miss Marple, we may find which one we face." Chapter IV. The lane that led to Peter Langford's cottage was narrow and sunken, its hedgerows rising high on either side like walls of shadow. The moon had climbed higher now, a thin, cold coin behind drifting cloud. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell abruptly silent. Holmes walked a pace ahead of Miss Marple and Watson, his silhouette long and angular against the pale strip of path. The air was sharp with the smell of damp earth and distant wood smoke. "There," Miss Marple said softly, lifting a hand. Peter Langford's cottage stood slightly apart from the others, as though it had drawn itself back from the village by a few cautious yards. Its roof sagged faintly, but the windows glowed with lamplight. Ivy clung to the walls, a gate hung crookedly from a single hinge. Holmes paused before the gate, his eyes narrowing. "Observe, Watson, 2 sets of recent footprints in the path, one heavier, one lighter. One pair of boots, one pair of smaller shoes. Someone has visited him tonight." Watson exhaled. "Inspector Crail, perhaps?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, Inspector Crail's boots are broader. Those print impressions are too delicate. I would say a lady and not a villager. The heel is too narrow for practicality." Holmes's lips curved. "You astonish me, Miss Marple." "Oh no," she replied mildly. "Villages train one's eye. It becomes quite impossible not to notice such things." Holmes lifted the latch without further hesitation and strode up the path. He rapped smartly on the door. After a moment, it opened. Peter Langford stood framed in the yellow lamplight, tall, fair, with a thoughtful, bookish face and a pair of eyes so pale they almost seemed grey. He wore a shirt-sleeves and waistcoat, as though interrupted mid-composition. In his right hand he held a silver pipe. Holmes's gaze lingered on it for half a second. "Mr. Langford," he said pleasantly, "I apologize for the hour. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Miss Marple, whom you already know. Langford's expression flickered with surprise, then settled into polite curiosity. Mr. Holmes, he said, the detective? Good heavens, to what do I owe the honor? Holmes's tone remained courteous. To Miss Emily Harper? A brief, unmistakable shadow crossed Langford's face. It vanished almost at once. Emily, he said, has something happened? I heard whispers in the village, but I refused to believe. May we come in? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but there was an insistence beneath it. Langford stepped aside. Of course. Forgive the state of the place I've been working. Ideas do not tidy themselves, alas. The sitting room bore the marks of a man who lived more in his thoughts than his surroundings. Books lay in small avalanches on every surface. Notebooks sprawled open, their pages scrawled with looping handwriting. A fire glowed in the small grate. On the table stood a single lamp, a bottle of ink, and 2 cups, one stained with tea, the other barely touched. Watson noticed that second cup as Holmes's eyes skimmed the room. You have had a visitor this evening, Mr. Langford, Holmes remarked lightly. Langford hesitated. A fellow writer from the next village, he said at once. He left an hour ago. Holmes's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where a folded handkerchief lay neatly placed. Laurel leaves were embroidered at the corner. Miss Marple's eyes followed his. How pretty, she said. A matching set, I think. I recall seeing something similar this morning. Langford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, a gift. I have several. Holmes crossed to the mantelpiece and examined the cloth without touching it. An elegant motif, laurel leaves, and recently washed, judging by the faint stiffness. Blood is stubborn, it leaves a memory behind, even when scrubbed. Langford's eyes flashed. I beg your pardon? Holmes turned. His voice had cooled by a degree. You knew Emily Harper, he said. You spent a considerable amount of time with her. You walked with her after school. You read to the children in her classroom. You were seen with her on the lane more than once. You admired her, did you not? Langford's shoulders tensed, then dropped. Of course I admired her, he said. Everyone did. She was kind, clever. She listened. A flicker of something raw crossed his features. If you are implying impropriety, Mr. Holmes. I am implying attachment, Holmes interrupted softly. On your part? Was it mutual? Miss Marple lowered herself onto a chair as though to knit, though her needles remained still. Mr. Langford, she said, Emily was very fond of kindness. It is a great hunger in frightened people. Did you comfort her when she was afraid? Langford swallowed. She had been through a great deal, he said. She told me some of it. A man in Devon, persistent, unstable. At first she thought he cared for her. Then she realized he wanted to own her. She ran away, changed parishes. She thought she was safe. Watson's hands tightened on his hat. Marcus Llewellyn, he said quietly. Langford's gaze jerked to him. You know his name? Holmes watched him with the stillness of a drawn bow. Marcus Llewellyn, Holmes repeated, solicitor's clerk, soft-spoken, charming to those he wished to impress. He admired another young woman before Emily Lydia Fairfax. Something in Langford's expression shuttered. Holmes went on, his voice low. Lydia died, Emily ran, and you, Mr. Langford, knew far more about both than you would care to admit. Miss Marple tilted her head. You do know Devon rather well for a man who claims to be purely a visitor, she observed. Langford's mouth twisted. You are very quick, Miss Marple. You use small phrases that do not belong to Street Mary Mead, she said gently. You call things by names we do not use. A village reveals as much by what it does not say as by what it does. Holmes took a single step closer. Where is Emily Harper? He said softly. Langford's fingers tightened around the silver pipe until his knuckles whitened. I don't know, he said. Holmes's gaze fell to the back of Langford's right hand, where a faint red line marked the skin as though from fingernails. She scratched you, Holmes murmured. When you tried to force her somewhere, she did not wish to go. Langford's composure cracked for a heartbeat. You have no proof of that. Holmes's eyes blazed suddenly. "In the shepherd's hut by the meadow," he said, "we found a smear of blood and a broken button from Emily's dress. We found also the imprint of a man's shoe, London-made, narrow, with a distinctive heel, such as you wear." His gaze dipped briefly to Langford's boots. "And in Miss Marple's garden, we found your handkerchief used to staunch that same wound." Watson felt the room shrink around them. "And the locket?" Langford said suddenly, with a bitter little smile. "Did you find that too, Mr. Holmes? Or did it find you?" Holmes's pulse drummed once, hard. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "You know the locket, then?" Langford's gaze flickered to it where it lay on the side table. Miss Marple had placed it there deliberately before they left the cottage, as though expecting it to be needed. "Lydia Fairfax's locket," Langford said quietly. "You carried it on the train, Mr. Holmes, fingering it in your pocket. I sat opposite you, half hidden behind a newspaper, while you stared out at the fields. You never noticed when I brushed against you to reach for my bag. You never noticed when your fingers touched only cloth afterward, and not silver." Holmes's jaw clenched. "So it was you," he said, "not some faceless thief. You stole it to torment me." "To remind you," Langford replied, voice soft, but vibrating with something taut and dangerous. "To remind you of what you abandoned. You left Lydia to fend for herself among men like Marcus Llewellyn, among men like me." Watson's skin crawled. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was very gentle indeed. "Then who are you, Mr. Langford?" she asked. "Truly?" Langford inhaled, shoulders rising, then sinking, the pipe lowered from his lips. "My name," he said, "is Marcus Peter Llewellyn. Marcus to Lydia, Peter to Emily. Langford is my mother's family name, a convenient shield. One learns to wear different faces when one is constantly told one is too much." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Too much what?" "Too much feeling," Langford whispered. "Too much intensity," Lydia said. "I frightened her. Emily said I suffocated her. And all the while, you," his eyes snapped to Holmes, "played at saviour and then vanished. You left them to their delicate consciences and their cowardice." Watson took a step forward. "Lydia feared you," he said. "She wrote to Holmes. She said if anything happened to her, it would not be an accident." Langford's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "Lydia slipped," he said. "She was clumsy. She changed her mind about meeting me by the river. She turned to go. She missed her footing." Holmes's voice cut through, icy. "No, you followed her, you cornered her, and when she refused you, you seized her arm. She pulled away, and you let her fall." For a moment, the little sitting room seemed to hold its breath. Langford's eyes shone. "Is that what you've pictured all these years, Mr. Holmes, in your sleepless hours?" Holmes's own voice dropped. "It is what I reconstructed from the angle of the bank, the height of the path, and the bruising described at the inquest. You were there. You could have pulled her back. You chose not to." Langford laughed once, a dry, cracking sound. "She would not belong to me," he said. "And then they told me you had been involved, that you had stayed in the village, that she had spoken of you." A flicker of pain crossed Holmes's face and vanished. "So you decided," Miss Marple said softly, "to punish him." Langford's gaze snapped to her. "To show him," he corrected, "to show him what it feels like to be helpless while someone you might have saved walks into danger." "And Emily?" Watson demanded. "What did she ever do to you?" "She ran," Langford said simply, "like Lydia ran, like they always run, once they've taken what they want from your devotion. But Emily had something Lydia didn't." He smiled faintly, chillingly. "She had Miss Marple." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the arms of her chair, but her expression remained serenely kind. "You wished to draw Mr. Holmes here," she said, "so you left a breadcrumb trail, the handkerchief in my garden, the shawl in my parlour, the locket. You knew I should put them before him." Langford inclined his head. "You are known, Miss Marple, even in Devon. The little old lady who solves murders with her knitting. When Emily spoke of you, I realized I had an opportunity. I could bring her here. I could recreate the conditions of the past. Only this time Mr. Holmes would have to watch. Holmes stepped forward, his voice a low, controlled fury. What have you done with her? Langford's pale eyes glittered. Would you like to guess, Mr. Holmes? He murmured. You always did enjoy puzzles. Holmes took a breath, forcing ice back over the heat in his chest. No, he said, I prefer answers. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small folded paper. Langford's eyebrows rose. And what is that? He asked. A note, Holmes replied, left under Miss Marple's vase this afternoon while you believed her to be occupied in her garden. He unfolded it, revealing neat but slightly hurried handwriting. Watson squinted. It's Emily's hand. Miss Marple nodded once. Yes, she must have written it when her captor grew careless. Her voice trembled faintly, but her eyes did not. I found it when I went to fetch more wool. Holmes read aloud. He keeps me where water once ran fast. I hear it still in my head. Please, Miss Marple, I am so tired of being frightened. E.H. Langford's composure cracked fully then. For the first time, Watson saw fear not for Emily, but for himself. You won't find her in time, he said roughly. The old mill is half collapsed. No one goes there. The old mill, Miss Marple repeated, very softly. Where water once ran fast, where there are stones and a drop and where, Holmes finished grimly, a man once let Lydia Fairfax fall to her death. You cannot help but repeat yourself, Mr. Llewellyn. Obsession has a pattern. He turned sharply to Watson. Emily is no longer there, he said. Inspector Crail and his constables removed her an hour ago. Langford stared. You're lying. Holmes's gaze was flint. Miss Marple realized the meaning of Emily's clue at once. She telephoned Crail, who for once chose prudence over pride. They found Emily in the old mill's storeroom, bound but alive, weak from shock. She is presently at the vicarage, under the doctor's care. Miss Marple folded her hands. I suspected you, Mr. Langford, she said quietly, long before Mr. Holmes did. Oh, he saw the cleverness, the calculated cruelty, the theatrical gestures. But I saw how you watched Emily when she spoke with the children, how your face went quite rigid when she laughed with young Peter Pierce, how you never quite believed she had a life beyond what you imagined for her. Langford's breathing quickened. You don't understand, he whispered. None of you understand. They promise without words, with the way they look at you, the way they smile. They awaken something, and then they call it too much when you brave the world for them. Holmes's voice cut through, razor-sharp. Love does not bind hands and hide women in abandoned mills, he said. It does not send taunting notes and replay deaths like theatre. That is not love, Marcus. That is possession, and it is the very thing Lydia feared. Langford's shoulders sagged as though some unseen cord had been cut. For a moment he looked simply exhausted, a man drained of all disguise. What now? He said quietly. Do you read out my sins to the village, Mr. Holmes? Do you let them stare? Holmes regarded him steadily. Then, with a small motion of his head, he nodded toward the doorway. Inspector Crail was standing there. He had arrived some minutes before, silent as a shadow, drawn by Miss Marple's earlier summons. 2 constables flanked him, faces grim. You should have left this village while you had the chance, Langford, Crail said coldly. Instead, you turned it into your stage. I don't tolerate that. Langford laughed once, very softly. You're late, Inspector, he said. The curtain has already fallen. Crail stepped forward and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. Marcus Peter Llewellyn, he intoned, I am arresting you on suspicion of the abduction and attempted murder of Emily Harper, and on suspicion of involvement in the death of Lydia Fairfax, to be considered by the proper authorities in Devon. Watson watched as Langford's pipe fell from his fingers and rolled across the floor, coming to rest against Miss Marple's sensible shoes. She looked down at it with something like infinite weariness. Langford lifted his head one last time, eyes searching for Holmes. "Did you remember then?" he asked quietly. "Did you finally remember enough to stop me?" Holmes's expression did not soften. "I remembered," he said, "but it was Miss Marple who understood." Langford smiled faintly, bitterly. "The great Sherlock Holmes," he murmured, needing a village spinster to untangle his heart. Miss Marple chuckled very softly. "Oh, my dear," she said, "he simply needed someone who knows how people break themselves for love." They led Langford out into the night. Later, in the vicarage drawing-room, a small group gathered in hushed candlelight. Emily Harper lay on a chaise longue, propped up against pillows, her face pale but alive. The village doctor stood nearby, murmuring reassurances. Miss Marple sat beside her, holding her hand gently. Watson hovered, ever the physician, his heart warmed by the sight of life restored rather than extinguished. Holmes stood slightly apart, by the window, watching moonlight wash over the church spire beyond. Emily's voice trembled. "I thought he would kill me," she whispered. "I thought he would make it look like an accident again, like with Lydia." Holmes turned. "You knew of Lydia Fairfax?" he asked gently. Emily nodded. "He told me. At first he spoke of her like a tragic story, how she broke his heart, how she was led astray by a clever man she trusted. I didn't understand, until he grew angry one evening and said he'd had to let her go." Miss Marple's thumb stroked Emily's hand. "You were very brave to write that note," she said. Emily gave her a watery smile. "I knew you would see. You always notice the silly little things, the way Mrs. Price folds her apron, the way the vicar forgets his gloves. I thought you might see me too." Holmes's throat tightened unexpectedly. Miss Marple's eyes glistened in the candlelight. "Oh, my dear," she said softly, "we saw you from the moment you arrived, even when others did not. That is what frightened Marcus most, I think, being seen and being told no." Emily closed her eyes briefly. "I'm so tired," she whispered. "So tired of being chased by men who call it love." Watson felt an ache in his chest. "In time," he said gently, "you will find peace. The mind heals, as the body does, with care and patience." Holmes watched her quietly, then spoke. "I am sorry," he said. Emily's eyes flew open. "For what?" she murmured. "For not seeing more quickly," he replied, "for allowing my past to cloud my judgment, for leaving Lydia's story unfinished." Emily studied his face for a long moment. "You helped finish it tonight," she said, "for both of us." Holmes bowed his head slightly. He did not trust his voice. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she watched him. "He carries his ghosts with such precision," she thought, "as if he fears they will vanish if he lets them rest." Inspector Crail entered quietly, removing his hat. "Llewellyn is in custody," he said. "We'll have to send files to Devon. They may reopen certain inquiries, but for now—" He glanced at Emily, then at Miss Marple and Holmes. "For now, I suppose I owe you all a measure of thanks." Miss Marple smiled. "You did quite well, Inspector. You listened. That is rarer than brilliance." Holmes's lips twitched slightly. Crail cleared his throat. "Yes, well, don't make a habit of London detectives, Miss Marple. They unsettle the sheep." He turned and left before anyone could answer. Emily's breathing steadied. The candle by the bedside flickered gently. Holmes moved back to the window, watching the slow drift of cloud. Watson joined him. "You did it, Holmes," he said softly. "You saved her." Holmes's gaze rested on the moonlit churchyard, where shadows lay like folded memories. "I did not do it alone," he replied, "and that is a novel experience." Watson smiled. "How do you find it?" Holmes considered. "Unsettling," he said. Then, after a pause, and oddly relieving. Behind them, Miss Marple murmured to Emily in low, soothing tones, speaking about roses and tea cakes and the small, stubborn comforts of village life, everyday things that might, in time, crowd out terror. Holmes touched the locket in his pocket, returned to him by Inspector Crail after being logged as evidence. Lydia's face was still inside, painted in miniature, eternal and unreachable. "I could not go back for you," he thought, "but I came this time. Does that redeem anything at all?" The candle on the mantel fluttered as a faint draught passed through the room, then steadied once more. Outside, the wind sighed through the hedgerows, carrying away, perhaps, the last echoes of a man who mistook possession for love. By the time Holmes and Watson escorted Miss Marple back to her cottage, the village lay in deep, satisfied slumber. Only one window glowed with stubborn light, Miss Marple's. She paused at her gate, turning to them. "You will be returning to London soon, Mr. Holmes?" she asked. Holmes inclined his head. "Tomorrow, perhaps. There is little more for me to do here. The rest belongs to inquiries and affidavits." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I shouldn't say that," she replied. "There's always plenty more to do. Comfort the frightened, encourage the remorseful, watch the quiet ones who pretend nothing has happened at all." Watson chuckled softly. "You are a formidable detective, Miss Marple." "Oh no, dear," she said. "I simply know how people can be. Lonely, foolish, afraid. Those three causes account for most of the trouble in the world, I think." Holmes's eyes glinted. "And what of those who create trouble out of cruelty?" he asked. Miss Marple's expression sobered. "They are usually lonely too," she said. "Only, they decide to take their loneliness out on others. That is a choice, and choices must have consequences." Holmes regarded her with quiet respect. "I have been accused," he said, "of seeing the world only in terms of deduction and motive. But you, Miss Marple, see it in terms of hurt and healing. I find that inconvenient to my habits." She laughed softly. "Oh, Mr. Holmes," she said, "you see far more than you admit. You simply don't always know what to do with the feelings that come with the knowledge." For once, Holmes had no immediate reply. She opened her garden gate, then paused and looked back. "When you think of Lydia in future," she said gently, "do not only remember the river, remember her courage in writing to you. Remember that she trusted you with her fear. And that, in Emily's case at least, you honored that trust." Holmes inclined his head. "You presume a great deal, Miss Marple." "I knit and I listen," she replied. "Presumption rarely enters into it." With that, she disappeared into her cottage. A moment later, the candle in her front window brightened, as though acknowledging its owner's return. Holmes and Watson turned back toward the lane. "She is remarkable," Watson said quietly. Holmes slipped his hands into his pockets, the locket cool against his fingers. "Yes," he said, "she is." They walked back into the sleeping village, the night around them no longer quite so burdened with unspoken ghosts. Behind them, in the quiet cottage where knitting and justice shared a hearth, Miss Marple sat down by the candle, her eyes turned inward, reflecting not only the day's events but the long, human patterns that stretched behind and ahead. The case of Emily Harper was closed. The consequences, as Miss Marple knew well, would ripple for a long time yet. Miss Marple's reflection. Evening had slipped softly through the village of Street Mary Mead, leaving behind a hush that felt almost sacred. Lamps were dimmed, curtains drawn, the chimneys stilled after a day of quiet gossip and relieved sighs. But in the small parlour of a certain ivy-clad cottage, one lone candle continued its nightly vigil. Its flame trembled faintly as Miss Jane Marple set aside her knitting and folded her hands in her lap. She sighed not in weariness, but in that thoughtful, far-off way of hers, as though turning over a piece of human nature in her mind and examining its many complicated sides. "Such curious creatures we are," she murmured aloud, though no one else sat with her. "Always believing we love when we merely wish to possess. Always running from what frightens us most, even when what we flee might save us." The room held the quiet comfort of well-lived years. Floral wallpaper, framed watercolors, neatly polished furniture, but tonight the shadows seemed deeper. Perhaps it was the weight of the past 2 days or the echo of footsteps belonging to a man who had never truly known love at all. Miss Marple reached for her teacup, now lukewarm, and stared toward the window where moonlight painted silver streaks across her lace curtains. She thought of Emily Harper, poor dear girl, asleep now in the vicarage guest room, watched over by Mrs. Pierce and the doctor's wife. Emily's face had carried that fragile blend of fear and relief. Miss Marple knew well, the look of someone who had survived their own story rather than become its ending. "She will heal," Miss Marple whispered. "She is young, and youth must be allowed its hope." Then her thoughts drifted, slowly, inevitably, to Sherlock Holmes. She smiled faintly. The great detective had left earlier that afternoon, coat buttoned, hat angled just so, his footsteps sharp along the gravel path. He had thanked her with a short bow, a gentleman's courtesy, but with something softer in his eyes, something almost like humility. He carries his grief like a violin case, Miss Marple thought, carefully, privately, and always near the heart. She recalled the moment Holmes stood silent by Emily's bedside last night, the locket hidden in his pocket, the shadows outlining his face. That hardened brilliance of his had seemed to falter just slightly, as though some long-sealed chamber inside him had finally unlatched. "Poor man," she murmured, "logic is no shield against sorrow." She took up her knitting again, letting the familiar click-click steady her thoughts. "Lydia Fairfax," she said softly, the name floating like a moth toward the candle flame. "A dear girl, too gentle to see danger coming, too polite to run fast enough. So many young women learn too late that kindness can be mistaken for invitation." Her needles paused. And Sherlock Holmes, so convinced that cleverness alone could stop a broken man with a poet's sigh and a tyrant's heart. She shook her head gently. "Emotion, my dear Mr. Holmes, is never so simple." The clock on the mantel chimed 9 soft notes. Miss Marple's gaze turned toward the corner of the room, where a dried lavender sachet hung on a small brass hook. Emily herself had embroidered it during her first month in the village, a gift for Miss Marple's kindness in showing her which neighbor would gossip and which would listen. Such small, thoughtful acts, they often revealed more about a person's character than all the loud declarations in the world. "Love," Miss Marple mused, "is not a net to be cast over another. It is a light one shares freely, and only while both hands are open." She thought of Marcus Llewellyn, then his cold eyes, his trembling voice when he spoke of Lydia, his bitterness twined with longing like poisonous ivy round a pillar. A pity, a terrible pity. "He might have been quite gentle," she said softly, "if only life had taught him tenderness before obsession." But this, Miss Marple had learned long ago, was the heart of human tragedy. Some souls grew twisted not from malice but from loneliness, the kind no one saw until too late. She rose from her chair, moved to the window, and drew aside the curtain to look upon her little village. Moonlight dusted the rooftops, the narrow lanes, the church spire rising like a silver needle against the night sky. Street. Mary Mead looked peaceful now, but Miss Marple knew that peace was always the brief rest between the pages of human drama. And Sherlock Holmes, she suspected he would carry this case with him for many years. Not because of the puzzle, clever men solved puzzles as easily as tying shoelaces, but because of the way it touched that hidden corner inside him where grief quietly slept. "Perhaps," she murmured, "our great detective will one day understand that even the keenest mind must sometimes lean upon another." Her smile softened. "And perhaps he will allow himself to remember Lydia without breaking." She let the curtain fall and returned to her chair. The candle's flame flickered as she passed it, casting long, slender shadows. Miss Marple lifted her notebook, a modest little thing with a blue cover, and opened to a fresh page. She recorded her reflections as gently as one might press flowers into a book. Some tragedies come upon us like storms, others tiptoe in as quiet as a worried girl on a garden path. But whatever form they take, they must be met with equal measures of compassion and clarity. She paused, then added, Sherlock Holmes possesses the latter in abundance. The former, perhaps he is learning. A tender softness touched her features. I do hope, she whispered, that he finds peace with that locket. The house creaked softly, the old wood settling into its nighttime rest. Miss Marple closed the notebook, set it aside, and reached to snuff the candle but paused. Its flame burned low, golden, steady, faithful. And, as the candle burned low, she murmured, another secret met its shadow. She slowly extinguished the light. The room fell into gentle darkness. Candlelight Mysteries Channel message. Dear listener, thank you for joining us beneath the soft glow of candlelight. Tonight, you walked beside Sherlock Holmes and Miss Marple through fog-laden lanes, moonlit meadows, and the quiet, trembling corners of the human heart. You have witnessed obsession unmasked, courage quietly awakened, and justice gentle yet unyielding carried out by minds both brilliant and wise. If this tale stirred your imagination, warmed your sense of mystery, or brushed against the deeper chambers of your heart, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every secret is revealed by the soft glow of candlelight. Here, every whisper hides a truth, every shadow guards a secret, and every story leads you through elegance, intrigue, and the delicate art of deduction, until our next tale flickers to life. Another Secret Fades by Candlelight.